He's been involved in ratio almost as long as I have, which has been 10 years, but he's in an unofficial capacity because he works at GE in the nuclear engineering department. But you've probably seen his face around tons of times, and we always enjoy having him come and share. And so I will turn it over to John.
All right, let's make sure our clicker is working. It is. Okay, so when Tom and I talked about this topic of theistic evolution, what we realized was this is probably a subject that we've never really talked about at length at Ratio Christi. We've had a number of talks that we've given about different ways to understand the creation narrative. We talked about evolutionary theory, we talked about young Earth, we talked about old Earth, but we never actually talked about theistic evolution itself. And we do get questions from time to time from students on that topic, because sometimes people view this as maybe this might be a way to compromise or to strike a balance between current modern day evolutionary theory, but yet still somehow holding to the idea that God exists, right? That's why it's called theistic evolution. And so what I thought we would do tonight is, rather than just dump a bunch of facts on you that you'll probably forget 5 minutes after you walk out of the room, I wanted to maybe take just a minute and to kind of describe for you the framework that goes with this, so that you can remember it and you can relate it to something you've probably already heard before, so that in the future when you encounter this, you'll have a mental hook to know how to relate it to other topics that we've talked about, or maybe that you've been here with us to talk about. So let's see. Okay, so this was my chart that I came up with, and I'm hoping this will give us a starting point for the discussion tonight. So what we're going to look at tonight is a couple of ways to understand the creation narrative, both from a biblical perspective and from a scientific perspective. Now I'm using here the age of the Earth as the starting point. That's arbitrary, but it seemed like this would be a good way to do it, because the flow chart kind of comes out of it nicely, and we can sort of step through it piece by piece. And I think it'll help with the discussion. And plus, age of the Earth always seems to be a topic Christian college students want to talk about for some reason. They just love age of the Earth. And so I thought, well, maybe this will help put it in context when we discuss this subject of theistic evolution. So, when you look at age of the Earth, generally speaking, you're going to have one of two views for the age of the Earth. You're going to have some folks that hold to what has traditionally been called a young Earth model. And the timeline here is somewhat arbitrary. It's meant to be sort of an approximate time period. That's why I put approximately. But most people you meet who hold the view that the Earth is young, and by young we mean roughly anywhere from about 6 to 8 or maybe 10,000 years old. Which sounds like a lot, but it's actually not a lot. It's actually quite young in geologic and astronomical terms. And then you got a group of folks that hold to an old Earth. Now, just for simplicity, I just said greater than 10,000 years. But it's actually, depending on the way you look at it, and depending on the people you talk to, it could be significantly more than 10,000 years. It could be millions, maybe even billions of years old. Again, and we'll look at some of the evidence that could support this. So, but we just generally say greater than 10,000. So that's the way we're going to define the old Earth, young Earth separation. There really is no other bucket here. It's either the Earth is young, and again, young roughly 10,000 years or less, or it's not. It's older, maybe somewhat older, maybe way older. And you have to kind of look at which view you want to investigate and how you want to affirm what you hear tonight. And my goal tonight is not to try to convince you of any view, but rather to give you the evidences that support all of these views and let you kind of decide for yourself. So I'm going to try to come at this as neutrally as I can, and we're just going to present the evidences for both viewpoints. Now there's a lot of scientific evidence we'll talk about. There's also historical evidence and biblical evidence, right? So there's several lines of evidence we're going to look at. If you hold a view that the earth is young, then sort of by definition, you're affirming that creation is young. And by creation, I mean plants, animals, fish, humans, anything living on the earth. We will just call that creation. So if you affirm a young earth, you almost by default have to affirm a young creation, right? So everything is, on the order of thousands of years old. Again, roughly less than 10,000. So you've probably heard of Ken Ham. This is the view that he has popularized quite a bit. He has, and I'll show you some of the references that I've got from him and others. And this is the so-called young earth creationist view. And we'll talk about where that came from. And we'll talk about, have people always held that view or not, and how that view came about. And then we'll look at the evidences, biblical, historical, scientific, for that. Then we're going to flip over to Old Earth. And we're going to look at Old Earth, and then we're going to look at two ways of seeing the Old Earth model. One is an Old Earth, but young creation. So in other words, creation, less than 10,000 years, but an Earth that's very old. So that is a possibility. It's entirely possible that the Earth could be very old, but yet creation, humans, plants, animals, fish, are relatively young, maybe 5 or 10,000 years old, right? Again, relatively young, which would kind of say that the Earth had been around for many, many, many years, eons, epochs, and then only recently creation has shown up on the scene in the last 10,000 years. So that would be Old Earth, young creation, popularized by Hugh Ross. If you've read his books or if you know anything about him, I've got some references. We'll share some of his thoughts on it. Then, of course, there's the classic Old Earth, old creation, meaning that not only is the Earth old, but all living creatures on the Earth, animals, plants, humans, did not arise by special creation, but arose from an evolutionary Darwinian process over, again, millions, maybe billions of years. Now, even within the old creation, Old Earth, old creation, there's actually two camps. One is theistic evolution, and one is atheistic or non-theistic evolution. You're probably familiar with the atheistic evolution one. That's our buddy Richard Dawkins, right? Who would say that no, God does not exist. That's why it's atheistic evolution. And then natural selection, random mutation, over a very, very long period of time, has led to the evolution of species, descent from a common ancestor. I would say the prevailing view today in most of academia would be this one. But this is the one you probably maybe have not heard much about, theistic evolution. Anybody know who Francis Collins is? Or have you heard of Francis Collins? Name ring a bell? Yeah. What do you know about him?
Oh, he's a geneticist.
Geneticist. So this man was in charge of the Human Genome Project in the 1990s, which was a massive multi-billion-dollar project that involved thousands of researchers across the U.S., universities all across the U.S. and the world, to map the human genome. Anybody have any idea how many genes there are in the human genome? Biology majors, anybody? Take a guess, wild guess, roughly? How many genes in the human genome, roughly? We'll give you credit for close. It's like horseshoes and hand grenades. What do you think? She's thinking. She's thinking.
No, it's like 20 or 2,000, or 20 or 20,000.
You are close.
Okay.
A little less than 30,000.
Okay.
A little less than 30,000. Excellent, excellent. So, which again sounds like a pretty decent number, but when you think about, and we'll look a little bit about the combinations that DNA can make with the double helix and the different types that can be formed, 30,000 genes is actually a lot. There's a lot of things that can be formed, a lot of combinations. So Francis Collins and others, he's not the first one to hold this view, but there are some who would say, no, we affirm that evolution, the process of natural selection, random mutation, does exist. However, we would say it's guided by an intelligence, namely God, or created by an intelligent agent, namely God. And so we would call that theistic evolution as opposed to non-theistic or atheistic evolution. And this view would say that it's just purely natural processes. There's no supernatural, there's no God. That's just the way nature works. So it's important to understand the distinctions between these two, between theistic and atheistic. This is supposed to be the talk for tonight, but in order to make my way all the way down this chain, we are going to have to touch a few of these stepping stones along the way, okay? So hang in there, we will get to the end, but I want to try to set the stage for what we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, any questions on this? This is our roadmap for tonight. Any questions on the layout of where we're going to go here? Okay, everybody good? Let's see if that clicker's working. Yes. So, very, 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 very important. Everything we're going to say tonight with regard to the understanding of biblical creation is not, and I repeat, not an essential doctrine when it comes to the age of the earth. You can have differing views on the age of the earth as a Bible-believing Christian, and you can come to different conclusions. You are not denying the authority of Scripture if you affirm an old earth or a young earth. And we're going to look at how people have come up with these conclusions of young earth, old earth. These are secondary issues when it comes to understanding biblical Scripture, right? When it comes to understanding the Bible. So do not make this a test for orthodoxy. If somebody's an old earth person or somebody's a young earth person, do not reach the conclusion that they are holding a view that is contrary to Scripture. And we'll talk about that because there's nothing in the Bible that says how old the earth is. That would seem to imply it's not a primary or essential doctrine. That would seem to imply it's kind of a secondary or maybe even a tertiary doctrine. Now, for example, what would a primary doctrine of the Bible be? What would be an idea, anything, that is absolutely essential to getting Christianity correct?
The deity of Christ.
There you go. If you think Jesus was just an angel or a prophet, as some religions do, then you've missed Christianity, because that is absolutely contrary to the Bible. You have to affirm the deity of Christ. That's not a secondary matter. That is a primary matter. That's an essential matter. So there are things, but good news is the Bible pretty clear on that idea. Yeah, I would say the Bible's pretty clear on that one. Not a lot of room for uncertainty on that one. So in areas of the Bible where things are abundantly clear, those would be what we would call primary doctrines. In areas where there's not an absolute or very, very clear explanations or ideas, those are secondary or tertiary doctrines, which means you could hold a slightly different view and it's okay. It's okay. You have to understand why you hold the view you do, but it's not essential to holding to the Christian faith. Does that kind of make sense? Does everybody kind of see where we're going with that? So, make primary things primary, make secondary things secondary, and don't confuse the two. Don't take a secondary issue and make it primary, but don't take a primary issue and make it secondary, because then you get in all kinds of trouble, right? So keep them in there, stay in the lanes, stay in the swim lane. Primary, secondary, secondary. We can disagree on those. This is going to be important because I would imagine in this room right now there are people who are genuine Christians who maybe disagree on the age of the earth, and that's okay. But I would hope we don't disagree on the deity of Christ as a Christian, right? That would be something that we shouldn't be disagreeing on. And C.S. Lewis, as always, has a great way of describing that. Okay, so here's the overview. Again, the roadmap I gave is probably better, but we're going to look at biblical and scientific, and I'll even say historical. I kind of lump historical in with biblical. Yeah, there it is, historical. We're going to look at biblical, historical, and scientific explanations for creation, what we see today in the world, and we're going to look at possible ways of explaining this, both from a young earth and an old earth perspective. We are going to look at theistic evolution, because that's supposed to be the focus of the talk, and we're going to investigate what that idea entails and how we understand it, and then we're going to look at the evidences for it, for and against, okay? And in many cases, we're going to be looking at both biblical and scientific evidences. and seeing how they stack up with one another for each of these views. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the biblical account, let's at least start in Genesis, right? This is where we see the description of the creation of the universe, the earth, right? All of creation, without reference to a time or a date, right? In the beginning, God created, but it doesn't say when the beginning was, right? So we do not know for sure. Now, some people, and you'll see in a few minutes, some people have tried to infer when that beginning was by looking at things in other parts of the Bible, like genealogies, which is a way to try to look at it, but it might also lead to an incorrect conclusion because it's not a primary doctrine. It's a secondary doctrine. So you can try to do this, but it might not give the correct answer. We don't know for sure. We're going to look at the different literary styles for the Bible. It's important to know those, right? And the Bible isn't all written in the same literary style. So you would not read, for example, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, which are historical narratives that talk about Jesus, where he went, what he did, who he saw, what miracles he performed. Those are very direct, very clear, literal, historical events that are described. You wouldn't read Matthew and think it was prophecy or figurative, right? You'd say, yeah, this literally happened. Jesus literally walked the earth. He literally turned water to wine. He healed the sick man, the blind man. These are actual, literal, historical events. So that goes with the literary style of the writing. Similarly, you wouldn't read, let's say, Daniel or Revelation and necessarily think that it's only using literal words. There's lots of figurative language in many of the prophets, the books of prophecy, that are symbolic. Now, they may be talking about actual events that'll happen, but they don't always use direct language. Sometimes they use figurative language. Some books are like poetry, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, right? So there's lots of literary styles here. So our job is to look at what did the writer say in the book or books, who was the audience, who were they writing to. Believe it or not, the Bible wasn't written to you, it was written to other people, but we can read it and infer a lesson or a principle that we can apply to our lives today. But none of us were alive when these books were written. So there's no way it was written directly to us. It was written to other people, and we can use this to try to understand biblical principles. So looking at the historical, social, cultural context, we got to be careful not to read our 21st century worldview into what we read. Many of these things were written thousands of years before Christ walked the earth. Most of the New Testament was written over 2,000 years ago. It was a different time. It was the ancient Near East. It was a different culture. It wasn't Western 21st century democracy. So we've got to remember that as you read this, right? Don't read in our 21st century perspective into things. Got to remember, it wasn't written directly to us, but it was written for us, but not to us. So that's going to be important when we look at how we understand all the verses and all the biblical passages that we're going to study tonight. Okay, any questions on this? Any questions on any of this? Okay, we're going to keep going since we got a late start. Okay, so let's look at the first. We're going to start on the left, and we're going to work our way to the right. So let's start with young earth, young creation, right? And again, those two go together, right? Young earth implies or directly leads to young creation. So that is what people refer to as the literal historical model. The literal historical interpretation of Genesis. Why do we say that? Well, because it looks at the first 3 or 4 chapters of Genesis, and it interprets and understands everything that's written there literally as the words say. It treats it as historical, like, in other words, God really does exist. God did create things. It's not, it's not mythological, right? It's literal, it's actual, there are actually things that happened. Adam and Eve were real people, they really did exist. It wasn't a Garden of Eden, it was an actual, real place. But it reads things from a literal, historical perspective only. So, when we see the word day in Genesis, this view would say that is a literal 24-hour day, because that's how we understand the word day. Now, there's a little bit of difficulty here, because the Hebrew word for day, yom, can be used to refer to other periods of time, not just a 24-hour period of time. One of the difficulties with studying Old Testament literature written in what language? Old Testament? Hebrew. Words that we use today, this is where our 21st century perspective comes in, when there aren't always one-for-one correspondence between words in Hebrew and what we know today as words in English in the 21st century. So you've got to be careful with how you transliterate words, how you understand the words. But this view would hold that the creation period was 6 consecutive 24-hour days with no gaps in between the days, like day 1, day 2, day 3, each one of them 24 hours. And in many cases, it utilizes the genealogy of Matthew, other books as well, but mostly Matthew, to try to reconstruct the timeline of when creation started, starting with Jesus and working backwards. And if you do that, and many people have, quite a few have actually, you would infer a lapsed time difference between Jesus and Adam of roughly 4,000 years, a little over 4,000 years. And of course, we're 2 centuries into that, so now it's like 6,000, so this would be about 6,000 years ago, right, roughly. So that would be the young earth creation. So it would say that earth and creation, I guess I should have put earth and creation here, earth and creation about 6,000 years old. Now there is a little wiggle room there. The genealogy in Matthew is not complete. It has gaps, but even if you take into account those gaps and you make reasonable estimates, maybe you come up with 7,000 years or 7,500 years. You're not gonna come up with 10 billion years, right? It's still gonna be on the order of less than 10,000 years. So there's a little bit of uncertainty there, but again, young Earth, 6, 7, 8,000 years old. This is a view that was held by some scholars in the 16th and 17th century. This guy right here, Archbishop Usher, was one of the first to actually sit down and go through this with pencil and paper, or I don't know, ink and papyrus, and actually came up with this number, and others now have done that since then. And it seems to be a pretty repeatable, number. Folks have come up with a very similar number. Interesting, it was kind of a minority view for a while. Like, not many people really held to it. But in the early part of the 20th century, the Seventh-day Adventists got a hold of this idea, and they thought it was a pretty neat model to look at. Now, does anybody know what was going on in the 1920s in the US and England? Like, what things were going on in this time period that would make folks want to kind of lean toward a young Earth? Like, there's a very famous legal case. Yes?
Scopes Monkey
The
Trial.
Scopes Monkey Trial. What was the Scopes Monkey Trial?
It was about a teacher in Bryan, Tennessee that was in prison for teaching evolution in class under a Tennessee state law that prohibited that activity.
Correct. And so modern day evolutionary theory, which really had started with Darwin in the 1800s, was starting to penetrate into the educational system, and there were some folks that were quite concerned, because that seemed to imply that the Earth was billions and billions of years old, and that humans didn't arrive through special creation, but maybe came along through evolutionary processes. So, this idea of a young Earth, 6, 7, 8,000 years, started to become really popular, because it obviates the possibility of evolution explaining where we came from. If the Earth's only 7 or 8,000 years old, there's no way all of that evolution is going to happen in 7,000 years, right? And so it seems to defeat the evolutionist view and the old Earth view by saying, hey, no, the Earth's only 6,000 years old. See, evolution can't be true. And that idea got a lot of popularity. It got a lot of traction, and it still has quite a bit to this day. In some circles, in some denominations, it has become a very popularized view. In fact, I'd be willing to bet some of you have seen this. Who's seen this? Come on, raise your hand. I know you've seen it. I know you've seen it. Yeah. Okay. That's this. There are churches that have this in their foyer, in their classrooms, in their studies. This is the biblical world timeline. There's no way I can read all this, as you can see. But this would be a pictorial or pictographic way of showing exactly what Ussher and others concluded. The young earth biblical worldview timeline. And you start here and you work all the way backwards and you get roughly 4004 BC is what you come up with when you do the math, right? So this has become a very popular view. Now the question is it correct? It could be correct. It could be correct. There is some very, I would say, strong biblical evidence for it, because if you interpret Genesis 1, 2, and 3 as literal, historical, that's a conclusion you could come to. There is some scientific evidence that would seem to support a young Earth. I'm not going to go through all these, but if you want the slides, we can make them available to you. There's a really good book on this if you want to read it. There seems to be some evidence that points to the Earth maybe not being billions and billions of years old. Young Earth interpretations of scientific data, particularly geologic, tend to point to a non-uniformitarian view of nature. Okay, that's a big word. What does that mean? Science generally assumes the uniformitarian nature of reality. In other words, like I'm sure when you were a kid, you went to the beach or you went to a river or somewhere, and you noticed when moving water goes through sand and silt and sediment, it creates like a little winding, thing, right? And you see the water going, and it's kind of shaping and carving the sand. And then you take a trip to Arizona and you stand in front of the Grand Canyon, and you're like, oh my gosh, that must be how the Grand Canyon was formed, with all that water and rivers and water rushing and sediment. In other words, we assume that the way nature behaved in the past is the same way it behaves today, and the same way it will behave in the future. That's a uniformitarian view. Gravity doesn't change. That's a uniformitarian view. Gravity was the same 1,000 years ago as it is today, right? We assume, right? It'll be the same 1,000 years from now. The young Earth scientific view, in some cases, rejects the uniformitarian view because it says there can be these catastrophic events, like a great flood, or other types of catastrophic events that might not lead to a strictly uniformitarian view of nature, and therefore the Earth might not be billions of years old. It might only be a few thousand years old. And again, there's some evidence that they would point to, the flood, geology, the fossil record, plate tectonics. They would say that it isn't always a uniformitarian view. Now, they're not always consistent with it. Sometimes they do affirm a uniformitarian view, so it's a little difficult sometimes to figure out what evidence they're using. But generally, that's how they would look at the scientific evidence around the age of the Earth. And from this, they would conclude the evidence seems to point to a young Earth. Oh, and by the way, the Bible points to a young Earth if you interpret Genesis literally, historically, 24-hour day. So see, there you go. Earth's 6,000 years old. That would be the way they would conclude. That's how they would view it. Now, lots of good books on this subject. I'll give you these references. You can read them. They're interesting. I would certainly encourage you to do that. I'm guessing most of you have heard of Answers in Genesis, right? Ken Ham, right? I'm sure you're probably familiar with that. This is actually quite a good book here, Creation Basics and Beyond. You can look at, this is from the Institute for Creation Research, ICR, kind of a big deal in the creationist, lexicon. And they're very good books. I've read this, I read a few of these. So again, there is some evidence to support this view, both scientific and biblical. So that's how a young Earth, young creation person would see it. Strictly literal, figurative understanding of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then some scientific evidence to support their view. In a nutshell, that's the young Earth creationist view. That's very abbreviated. I'm sure I didn't do it justice. If you want to know more, I can certainly give you references to read and look at. Any questions on that? On how young earth, young creation would establish their view? Okay, that's kind of the essentials of it. Okay. But what if that literal historical interpretation is not correct? What if the 6 days described in the Bible are not meant to be understood in strictly literal terms, but perhaps there's figurative language used to describe the historical events? That might say that a literal rendering of the 24-hour period of time might not always be correct, that it might be something different. And it's possible that if that's the case, then the days really don't refer to a strict literal 24-hour day, but refer to some other period of time. Like if I said Michael Jordan was a great basketball player in his day, would you think I was trying to tell you that he was a great basketball player for 24 hours? Probably not. Okay, same thing, right? Same thing. It can refer to a period of time or an epoch. It doesn't always have to necessarily refer to a literal 24 hour. And we see the word yom used in Genesis in this way. It's not always used as strictly literal. So you have to understand the context of the passage to be able to understand that. So, what would happen if that were the case? Well, there are some indications in the biblical text that might suggest that the word yom might not always explicitly mean a literal 24-hour day. About half of the uses of the word yom in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 do not refer to a literal 24-hour period of time. About half use the word in another way. Like Michael Jordan was a great basketball player in his day. I'm sure you've heard the day of the Lord, right? The word is used about half the time, not in a literal historical way. This is the day the Lord has made, referring to the entire creation period, not a single day. There is evidence to say that this could be a figurative literary model that helps to describe how the Israelites are to understand time. 7 days a week, right? But it might not be necessarily literal. It can be used as a figurative illustration. God illustrating a pattern to the Israelites. The seventh day never ends, as far as we can tell. There's no end to the seventh day, as far as we know. Day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 say evening, morning, day 1. Evening, morning, day 2. But there is no such end of day 7. Interesting. On the third day, the earth brings forth vegetation. Not special creation. The earth brings forth vegetation. So do we really think the earth went from nothing to fully vegetative, all kinds of living in 24 hours? How would the Jewish people, how would the nation of Israel understood that? Would they have thought that? Probably not. They probably wouldn't have thought that you go from nothing to completely grown vegetation in 24 hours. The sun doesn't appear until day 4. That's kind of weird. Don't you need the sun to define day and night? Seems a little odd. There is no grammatical rule for a literal day ordinal numbering in Genesis. There's nothing that says you must interpret this as 24-hour period of time. There's nothing that says that. Now you can, but if you don't, it may not be incorrect. And the 24-hour day itself can be used as a figurative literary device. So there are a number of things in Scripture that might indicate that maybe it's not meant to necessarily be understood as a literal 24-hour day. And in which case, then maybe the earth could be older. We could have an older earth, but could we have an old earth but young creation? Not old earth, old creation, old earth, young creation. It's possible. And when you look at, oh, I think I went the wrong way, sorry. And when you look at the language that's used in Genesis, there are some that would say that it is a blend of historical and figurative languages. So it's not purely figurative, but it's not purely literal either. It's not purely historical only. So for example, the figurative historical model would say that Adam and Eve were actual people. They really lived. God intended us to understand them as actual people, but there's a lot of figurative language that's used, right? The word Adam in Hebrew means man, kind of referring to humanity. Eve means mother of humanity in Hebrew. So the names have figurative significance. There seems to be something that's indicating that it's more than just literal. I mean, what about after Adam and Eve sinned and they're walking around the garden? What does God say? Where are you, Adam? Where are you, Eve? God didn't know where they were? It doesn't seem to make much sense, right? What do you think that means when God was looking for them? Did he really not know where they were? What happened in Genesis 3? The fall, they sinned. Perhaps it's a figurative description of their relational separation and not a literal God not knowing where they are. Maybe it's figuratively describing the separation, but not literally. Because otherwise, this really calls into question God's omniscience. They were the only two people on earth, and he didn't know where they were. Doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Obviously, he knew where they were, but it's figurative to convey the idea that they've been separated from him because of their sinful behavior, right? So he was looking for them, but he knew where they were. So there's a lot of reason to think that possibly the stylized prose, the structure, could indicate that maybe a strictly literal only interpretation is not correct. It's possible that it could be figurative historical. It's still historical, but it uses figurative language to describe the historical events. If that's the case, then it's possible that the earth could be older than 6,000 years. How old? We don't know. But certainly older than 6 literal days. You might be surprised to find that over the years, Christians have wildly disagreed on this subject. There have been numerous biblical models for creation. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's been a discussion or uncertainty about the period of time in between day 1 and day 2. Was there a gap between those days? There's multiple different models. Or were they meant to be understood as 24 hours, but then this very large undefined gap? Or not as 24 hours with still an undefined gap? And I will tell you that some church groups and leaders did not always hold to a strictly literal, historical understanding of Genesis. There have been many that would not hold to that view strictly. There are some that do, but there are many that have not. So don't make that a test for orthodoxy. People throughout history have disagreed on this. It's a secondary issue. It's not a primary issue. We could hold different views on it, and it's okay. There's also this one. This one is what's called the literary framework model. I don't know if you've ever thought about this. It's actually pretty cool. So day 1, there is temporal separation. God creates separating light from darkness. Day 2 is water and air, the spatial separation. And day 3 is water and land, spatial separation. And then when you look at day 4, you've got luminaries, the sun, the moon. Day 5, fish and the birds. Day 6, beast and man. Now, you see the first 3 days, God overcoming the formlessness of creation. And on the next 3 days, God overcoming lifelessness. putting life into the earth. But things get really interesting when you go this way. There's actually a correlation between day 1 and day 4, day 2 and day 5, and day 3 and day 6. There is a literary style that's used here to describe this. Now, do we think that all of these things literally happened? Yes. But the language, the description, has figurative elements to it. It's got a literary style that has a particular structure, right? So we see this all the time. And this is important to keep in mind because it's entirely possible that we could be looking at actual events but described with figurative or not literal descriptions, but yet still describing historical events that actually took place. Okay, one of the problems that comes up with the old earth, young creation, gotta get my terms right here, old earth, young creation, is this idea of death, right? Is death in Genesis, that's described in Genesis, physical, spiritual, or both? There's a lot of indication that would say, again, that it might not be strictly understood in literal terms. What did God say when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? That very day you will die. They would surely die that very day. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, because Adam lived to be, according to Genesis, 930 years old. He didn't die that very day. That would be the literal interpretation. So perhaps the death here is not literal, it's figurative, it's spiritual. It represents something else. It's a spiritual death. You see this all throughout Old Testament and New Testament. Were they mortal before the fall or not? It's possible that they were mortal before the fall. At least the way some of the text reads. The tree of life was planted in the garden before the fall, yet after the fall God says they can now live forever and must be banished from the garden. Does that indicate that they might have been mortal before the fall? Like, what if the fall never happened? Would they have died anyway? It's possible. Now, the young earth view would say, young earth creation view would say no, but again, there's some evidence in the biblical text that might say otherwise. God called his creation very good, but not perfect, since man had dominion and nature needed to be subdued. Which means that perhaps good doesn't mean perfect, it means according to its nature, not perfect. So I know some people would hold the view that, before the fall, a lion wouldn't kill a rabbit or something, because that's when sin entered the world. But actually, good might not mean that. Good might mean they act according to their nature, which means that that's a possibility, that they could act according to their nature. It's entirely possible that animal death might have preceded the fall of man, since again, the death, if you don't understand it as physical, literal, but rather spiritual, animal death wouldn't have been affected by man's spiritual death, because they're not redeemed souls, they're animals. They don't have a human soul. They're not made in the image of God. And look, we aren't the only ones to think this. Thomas Aquinas said, no, the nature of animals was not changed by man's sin. In his view, animals would act according to their nature and would never be affected by the sin of man. So that's possible. Only man is created in God's image. So there's a number of reasons to think that perhaps it is actually possible that the earth, that a strictly literal interpretation might not be always correct. One of the things that we learn in history is that when you look at verses of scripture like this, it's important to understand the context. So in the 16th century, there were a number of people who thought that the earth was the center of the solar system. Lots of people thought that, actually. Why did they think that? The world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. All the earth, yes, the world is established. It shall never be moved. The world is established. It shall never be moved. Getting the hint here? He sets the earth on its foundation so that it should never be moved. Does the earth move? Yes, the earth moves. Is this meant to be understood literally? No, it's a figurative style of communication. It's not meant to be understood literally. We now know that the earth moves, rotates and revolves. This is what got our buddy Galileo in trouble. Because he was looking at the scientific data and saying, hey, Earth's not the center of the solar system. And not many people liked that answer. Because they were holding to a strictly literal understanding of these verses. When in fact, that was wrong. It's not meant to be understood literally. So you have to be careful with this. You've got to be careful. You've got to be consistent with how you're interpreting Scripture. You have to understand the biblical context, and you have to be able to rationalize and understand what the writer was trying to communicate. I think what these writers were trying to communicate was the figurative idea that the world is established by God, sustained by God, created by God, for a special purpose, for us humans to live on, but it's not stationary. That's not what the words are intended to convey. Even though that's what the language says. That's not actually literally what it means, right? So there's a lot of important things to keep in mind with this. Okay, so that is all of the biblical, I would say, evidence that would say it's possible that the earth is not young. Is there evidence to say that the earth might be old, but creation could still be young? Yes, there is evidence for that. I'm not going to go through all this. It's a lot of scientific data. Again, I can give you the book if you want it. But there's a fair amount of scientific data that would say it's possible that the earth is not 6,000, 7,000 years old, but actually quite a bit longer. However, creation could be young. Creation could be only a few thousand years old. And the earth was just uninhabitable for many, many years before. That's a possible view. That would be old earth, young creation. And in fact, if you look at the geologic temperature records, you find something absolutely fascinating. This is where we are today. This is zero. This is where we are today. This is 10,000 years ago, 20,000, 30,000, 40, I got a little wonky here with my scanner, but you get the idea. These are ice age. These are periods of ice age. So this is temperature, so zero is where we are now. We're right at zero. Zero is normalized to today's average temperature on the earth. Right? So that's zero. But you'll notice that there were periods of a significant ice age, then it warmed back up, then there was an ice age, then it warmed back up, then there was an ice age. But we noticed something really fascinating. In the last 10,000 years, we've not had an ice age. It's been relatively warm and stable. Notice here, when the ice age occurs, the temperature plummets relatively fast. But here, we have this flat sort of area of moderate warm temperatures that coincidentally is about 10,000 years in length. So could the earth be significantly older than 10,000 years, but yet creation only be 10,000 or less? It's possible. It's possible. And some scientists would say that these are the geologic the ice age patterns that run about every 100,000 years or so. About every 100,000 years, from what we can tell, we have an ice age. But the interglacial periods, the temperatures will rise and then drop. But in this interglacial period, it's been pretty flat for quite some time. And an old Earth, young creation person would say, there's a reason for that. That's where creation arose. That's where humans and animals and plants and vegetations arose. So there is some evidence that would suggest that perhaps the Earth could be old, but creation could be young. Okay, questions on that? Annie, yes?
I have a question about the graph where it has the
So this is present day here. So this is 0 years ago. It just doesn't show it. It just doesn't show a 0. There should be a 0 here.
Oh,
So this is 0 years ago. This is where we are today. This is 100,000 years ago, 200,000, 300,000, and kind of a scrunched 400,000.
Oh, okay.
And this 0 is the temperature, so everything is normalized to the temperature today. So if you follow 0 across, it should put you right about in the middle of this. That's about where we are. And you'll notice that temperature varies by maybe 1 or 2 degrees Celsius. It's not always constant, it does vary a little, but it varies a little bit, but not much. I mean, here's 2, here's -2. The -2 is down here, right, outside the circle. So this is like a ½ degree Celsius, maybe 1 degree Celsius, not much. Again, these are the average temperatures on the Earth. So it's relatively flat. But when you look at an ice age, holy cow, it drops like 8 or maybe even 10 degrees Celsius. That's a lot for the average temperature on the Earth, right? That's a lot. This is Celsius now, not Fahrenheit. This is Celsius. Yes?
Wouldn't it be the other way? It gets significantly faster after an ice age?
So it
Hotter
drops after an ice age.
But
and-
the
yeah, it goes
it's
this,
going
it
to
goes
the left,
this
yeah.
way.
So it gets warmer after an ice age?
Correct, because
Okay.
ice age is cold.
Yeah.
Yeah, ice age is cold, and then it warms up, and then it drops again cold. Then it warms up, and then it drops again cold. But what happened here was, it warmed up again, but it never dropped. It should have dropped by this time. If it's following these patterns, look how sharp those points are. It should have gone up and then immediately down. But it didn't. It recovered, and then it just kind of hung around there for like, 10,000 years. Yeah.
How are we getting the data from?
So this is taken from core samples in the glacier Antarctic, and it's proportional to CO2 levels, interestingly enough, and they can infer the average age for the glacier, for the geologic glacier formation, by going down into the glacier. Now, so it's not a direct measurement. Yet nobody was alive 300,000 years ago to measure this, right? This is inferred from geologic measurement. Right? But, so it is not a direct measurement, it's an inference from measurement. But it's at least possible, that the Earth could be old, but yet creation could be young. It's at least possible. So that's kind of the idea behind old Earth, young creation. It's not completely out of the realm of possibility. Good questions. What other ones do you have? Any other questions? By the way, this is in Hugh Ross's book, if you want to read it. That's a very good book. I think I have it here. Yay, there he is. So, interesting book. Might be worth reading, right? I gave you the Institute for Creation Research. That's the young Earth, young creation. Here's the old Earth, young creation view. You might want to read that. Pretty interesting. It is kind of sciencey. So if you hate science, maybe you don't want to read it. But it's not too bad. It's not too bad. But he does a really nice job of kind of explaining all the stuff I just showed you on those graphs. So it's an interesting book. You might want to look at it. You might want to consider it. Again, not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying it's possible that the Earth could be old and creation could be young. It's at least possible. Okay. Questions on any of the old Earth, young creation? Yes?
What would someone who believes in old Earth, young creation do with carbon dating that shows living organisms to be over 10,000 years?
So carbon dating is good to about 50,000 years, right? Carbon dating is the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, and half-life is about 6,000 years. So once you go beyond about 6 or 7 half-lives, about 50,000 years, the measurement doesn't yield any useful information anymore. So for organic matter, you can't use carbon dating beyond about 50,000 years. Now there's other ways of doing dating, but not for organic matter, not for fossils. And that's a pretty well agreed upon fact for fossil carbon dating. Now you can date inorganic matter in a totally different way, and it's not limited by that. But for carbon-14 dating, it does have its limitations. So yeah. And again, but if you hold a old Earth, young creation, you would say we shouldn't find fossils that are 50,000 years old, right? Because we've only been around 10,000 years. And if you hold to the old Earth, young creation, you shouldn't find a fossil that's 300,000 years old or something. Probably not, right? So again, it's kind of a blend of the two. It sort of affirms what the young Earth, young creationists do, but just with an old Earth that was uninhabitable for many years. Does that make sense? Is that kind of making sense? Okay. Right? So in other words, an old Earth, young creationist would say we're not going to find fossils that are 50,000 years old, because life's only been around for less than the last 10,000 years. Right? That's what they would say. That's how they would view it. That's their view. That's their view. Okay. All right. So again, this is the old Earth, young creation view. All right. What about old Earth, old creation? Okay. Now we're on the right side of the flow chart. Old Earth, old creation. All right. So when we're on that side of the chart, we have pretty much two choices. Either it's an old Earth, old creation that was guided by some sort of divine power, like God, or it was old Earth, old creation that was driven and directed by natural processes of natural selection and random mutation. Atheistic evolution. But if the Earth is old, it is possible that it could be that humans arose from a God-directed evolutionary process. Or humans and animals arose from a non-God-directed evolutionary process. Because if the Earth is old, this is possible. All right? So what do we do with this? All right, let's look at each of these. When you look at theistic and atheistic evolution, both views tend to point to the same scientific evidence, which is the evolutionary Darwinian process, right? Because they are assuming that creation occurred gradually over billions of years, slowly evolved, and now we're here today, billions of years later, okay? So scientific evidence, they would both pretty much have the same scientific evidence. One would say it was God-directed, and one would say it was not God-directed. But the end result was pretty much the same. Now, the main differences are that theistic evolution says that God created the process and perhaps took his hands off and let it do its thing, sort of like deism in a way, right? We study deism, I think, with our group here, right? Where God kind of like winds up the universe and lets it go. Well, they would take kind of a deistic view that God created everything that was needed for evolution and then just took his hands off and let it run its course naturally, right? And then, of course, there are some who would say, nah, God doesn't even exist. What are you talking about? Atheistic evolution says there is no God and attributes everything to natural processes. Right? That would be the Richard Dawkins one on the chart, right? So those are the two ways of looking at it. All right? Can we get there by comparing it to the biblical record? It's not easy. It's not easy. In fact, it's quite challenging. In order to do this, you would have to make the assumption that everything in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is purely allegorical or mythical. In other words, you have to assume Adam and Eve were not real people. They never lived in time and space. There was no such thing as the Garden of Eden. You would have to hold the view that everything is figurative and allegorical. There's nothing literal at all in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Some people hold that view. And so when you see verses like this, God said, let us make man in our image, so God created man, then God formed man from the dust and created woman. All figurative. All figurative. Nothing literal in there whatsoever. Because there's no way you can square gradual evolutionary process with this account of creation. Because there's nothing in here that would say that this is pointing to evolutionary theory. Yes?
And then the fall of man with the eating of the apple, that's all figurative as well?
Yes, it would say everything's figurative. Yeah. Correct. So, that's a view you can take. I think that's a difficult view to defend. I think that's a really difficult view to defend, and I'll tell you why. There are tons and tons and tons of biblical evidence that would say Adam and Eve were not figurative, mythological beings. Tons. Jesus himself who I hope we would all agree is not figurative or mythical, refer to Adam and Eve as actual literal people who lived on the earth and did things. I'm not going to read all these, but here's all the references. This is just a short sampling of all the references. But there's incredibly good biblical evidence to say Adam and Eve were not figures of speech. They were not mythological creatures. The whole story wasn't an allegory. There is a historical component to Genesis. Now, we can disagree on whether the language is strictly literal or figurative, but the fact is, the biblical evidence seems to really point to the fact that they were actual people who lived, which kind of shoots the theistic evolution creation story dead in its tracks, because there's no way you can square that unless you try to hold the view that everything in the first 3 chapters of Genesis is figurative. That's just a really difficult position to take from a biblical standpoint, because there's a lot of evidence in the Old Testament, and even some in the New, quite a bit here in the New Testament, that would say that they were not figurative. They were not mythological. It wasn't just a story or an allegory. It was they were actual people that lived and had actual events in time and space. Okay, so that gets through the biblical part of it. How do we deal with the scientific part of it? All right, scientific part is, again, theistic and atheistic hold pretty much the same view. Theistic evolution and atheistic hold, by and large, the same view from an evolutionary standpoint, that life arose through natural selection. Creatures described as changing over time. It talks about how they change, how they adapt. Again, you've probably heard me talk about this subject before. A lot of it started with Darwin, but of course it's gone on much farther than that. And it would, the scientific evidence that some would say would point to the fact that it wasn't special creation, it was the slow, gradual evolutionary process that produced all life on Earth, including humans, that occurred over many, many eons of time. And again, when you look at the structure of DNA and you look how it operates, we actually do see small evolutionary changes in creatures on the Earth. We do. We do. We see black moths and white moths changing their colors based on a survival advantage. So, I mean, in the Industrial Revolution, moths were primarily black, but then were primarily black, but then when the Industrial Revolution came, there was a mutation that occurred and started producing white moths. White moths were very easy for predators to spot, and so black moths became the dominant color. That mutation gave them a survival advantage over the white moths. And in fact, black moths became very predominant in England during this time period because they had a survival advantage because of that mutation. So we do see this in nature. Now, it's on a very small scale, and it stays within a species, but we do see this. Darwin observed it. Galapagos Islands. Look, the last 4 years, we've all lived this. Why do you think the original COVID vaccine didn't seem to do much after the first 2 years? What happened to the virus? It mutated. It's trying to survive. It mutates, and guess what? The vaccine's not effective anymore. We see this in nature. We see this in nature. So it's not impossible to think that this type of behavior perhaps could be used to explain how life evolved on Earth. Now, that's a long way to go, talking about viruses and moths, to human beings evolving, but it's at least possible. And in fact, this is the kind of stuff you would see. You'd see there appears to be a lot of similarity in the DNA between humans and apes. We seem to have this missing link. We seem to have similar homology, similar body functions, bodily functions. We seem to have similar embryo shapes. Well, some people would look at this and say, hey, maybe special creation isn't how we got here. Maybe this adaptive evolutionary process is how we got here. Okay? However, there's a lot of things that would seem to point against this too. And again, I'm not going to read all of these, but there are a number of different things that in the last 50 years have pointed to the fact that maybe it's not as slam dunk a case as we thought. And again, I won't go through all these, but the funny one to me was this 1967 Mathematical Wistar Institute. So a bunch of mathematicians got together and said, hey, we can prove mathematically that humans could evolve from a simple, let's say, amino acid to humans in like 4 billion years. And so they actually started to put the model together and ran the calculations, and what they concluded was, you can't get there in 100 billion years. And they presented it at the conference. And they said, hey, look, we're not biologists, but the math doesn't work. There's no way 4 billion years is enough time. Wasn't very well received by the evolutionary biologists of the day, but it's an interesting data point. We see lots of things that maybe this could be explained in other ways. I mean, is it possible that we have similar DNA to other creatures because we're designed by the same creator, not because we evolved from a common ancestor? Possible. Is it possible that there are processes that we see in the world today that are really hard to describe or explain through evolutionary small adaptive changes? There are. So a lot of things we see in nature that are really hard to explain by small adaptive changes through evolutionary processes. So it's not as much of a slam dunk as you might think. The concept of irreducible complexity is perhaps one example of where perhaps it's hard to really come up with a way to explain how a very complex macromolecular organism could have evolved in a step-by-step fashion when you need all 10 steps in order for the function to work. How would a process like that evolve in a step-by-step fashion if you don't get the full function until the 10th step is completed? All parts seem to have to appear at once in order for the function to work, and the flagellum of a bacteria is one of the examples they use. So, it's certainly possible that maybe this idea of human and evolution of life on Earth maybe isn't as convincing as we once thought. When you look at the genomes of different creatures, like here's the canine genome, there's the human genome, right? We got 23 pair of chromosomes. The dogs have 19. It's not just that the DNA is different. There's information in the human genome that just does not exist in a canine genome. So it's one thing to say, take the existing DNA and modify it or adapt it. It's another thing to say you have to actually add new information to get a different species. How do you add new information? I understand modifying and adapting existing information, but how do you actually add new information? I don't know how that would work. Seems like a stretch, right? Seems like a little bit of a stretch. John Lennox has a great illustration. He says that a chimp and humans share 99.8% of their DNA is actually in common. They share nearly 100% of their DNA is the same, just a slight difference, 0.2% difference, not much. And so a lot of people would say, well, see, we told you, we've evolved from apes. Well, maybe. If you look at the human genome, again, 25,000 or so, right? You got it right. And you look at a chimp genome, there's only about 50 genes difference. That's about 0.2%, right? Not many genes difference. There's only a few genes that are different. But when you look at the gene expression states, whether the gene is expressed or not expressed, the number of different gene expression states is enormous, even just for a difference of 50 genes. An enormous difference in how the genes are expressed. And so a small difference in the number of genes could easily account for large phenotype differences between species. So they could have very similar blueprint. You probably don't know this, but your DNA as a human is about 70% the same as that of a banana. It is. bananas and humans have about 70% similarity in their DNA. I'm not trying to say they're a fruit, but, so is it possible that what we're seeing here is sort of the signs of this creator using the same blueprint and then just modifying the gene expression states to have different variations in different species? Yeah, it could be a common designer, not a common ancestor, perhaps. There's a lot of disagreement these days about Darwinism. It's gaining more and more dissension among the scientific community. There's a lot of things that it would seem that are very difficult to explain by natural evolutionary processes. I mean, there are some things that seem to have no survival advantage whatsoever. Like art, poetry, music. I mean, what's the survival advantage of that? But yet we all seem to recognize the value or the beauty in things that have no survival advantage. Things like self-sacrifice. How does that survive billions of years of evolution? It would seem like you sacrifice yourself and your gene pool is finished and you don't pass on your genes to anybody else because you sacrificed yourself. But yet we still have virtues like morality, ethics, free will. A lot of these things are hard to explain from a purely evolutionary physical material process, right? So yeah, it's gaining more and more criticism. It's gaining more and more skepticism in the scientific community over time. And it's worth thinking about. It's entirely possible that we didn't evolve through evolutionary processes. Here's Francis Collins. He would be the guy to read if you want to look at theistic evolution. And it's actually a very good book. I would encourage you to read it. I enjoyed it thoroughly. He does try to address this supposed tension between science and faith, and I think he does a pretty good job. He does not address the direct conflict with Genesis 1, 2, and 3. He doesn't even talk about it, right? Probably for obvious reasons, because it's nearly an impossible position to defend. But he does talk about the harmony between science and faith, and again, he would be an example of the theistic evolutionist. Old earth, old creation, theistic evolution. Okay, closing thoughts. We're going to run out of time here. So, it's important to keep in mind, there have been many biblical interpretations of chapters of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. You can justify young earth, young creation, if you hold to a literal only understanding of Genesis, the first 3 chapters. And that, in fact, could be correct. However, it's entirely possible that you could have an old earth with young creation if you use a figurative historical account. And there is pretty good scientific evidence that seems to say that the earth is older than 10,000 years. But creation could be young, right? So it would obviate the evolutionary pathway, but it would still say special creation as described in Genesis, not this evolutionary process. Old earth, old creation, seems to be very strongly at odds with the biblical record of Genesis 1, 2, and 3, because there's absolutely nothing in those 3 chapters of Genesis that would imply in any way that humans evolved gradually over a long period of time through small adaptive changes. Again, other than just saying the whole thing is figurative. But there seems to be good evidence against that. So it would be hard to hold that view. Atheistic evolution is starting to gain a lot of questions these days. The complexity of the human genome, human characteristics that are hard to describe or define or explain by gradual evolutionary processes, again, makes it a somewhat more untenable position. You have to have good reasons to hold that it's true. And again, this would also directly conflict with the biblical record, right? Because there's nothing in the Bible that would point to this. Important to keep in mind, and I've met a lot of students who seem to think theistic evolution is like, it's a nice little compromise between holding to the idea of God creating stuff, but still not trying to fight against evolutionary theory. But when you think about it, it's actually, I would argue, the worst position to hold. Because not only do you have to contend with the fact that it conflicts directly with Genesis. But you have to also account for the fact that there are gaps and challenges to the scientific evidence. So it has the same problems that atheistic evolution has when it comes to the scientific data, but unlike atheistic evolution, because it's theistic, it has to contend with the Bible and the biblical record, which it can't really reconcile at all. So it's actually a harder position to defend, because you got to fight a war on two fronts. You got to contend with the scientific data, and you got to contend with the biblical data. So it's actually, I would argue, actually creates more problems than it solves, because now you've got to contend with two lines of evidence rather than just one. So again, important to keep in mind when you're doing your homework and your research on this, but there are people that still hold this view. But I would say it's a hard view to hold. It's a hard view to justify in light of the evidence, both scientific and biblical, historical. Okay, all right, I'm done. I want to stop talking. What questions do you have? Or what comments or concerns? One of my favorite quotes. Yeah, question, yeah. I saw you, we'll go here first.
So it seemed to me like you were addressing theistic evolution from a biblical theistic perspective. What if you took that from a deist perspective and used that to solve the something from nothing problem, and then science can play itself out because scripture is not,
You could.
I would interpret it as not deist, so
Correct.
it doesn't have the conflict.
You're right. I mean, you could have used the Quran. You could have used Islamic theism. Yes, correct. So we're only, because of the nature of our group here, we're only going to consider biblical theism. But yes, you would have to address that separately with other theistic views. Yeah, and a deist view would perhaps deny miraculous events. So yeah, it's possible. You'd have to let that play out on its own. Yeah, good point. Yeah, somebody got a hand up over here? Yeah.
My question is about the theological problems created by theistic evolution.
I'm gonna go here. My ears are I'm getting old. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
About the theistic, the problem, the theological problems that theistic evolution creates.
Yes.
Specifically Genesis 1 through 3. I was wondering if you're familiar with the cosmic temple interpretation.
I am not.
Okay. I was wondering because there's a guy on YouTube I watch who's a theistic evolutionist. I don't agree with him. That's interesting. He has a really interesting view because he's a theistic evolutionist. But I think he kind of deals with some of the theological problems. He didn't come up with it. He holds to like cosmic temple interpretation. There's an Old Testament scholar, Christian scholar named John Walton. I don't know if he came up with it, but I think he made a problem with it.
Okay. Yeah, look, there are lots of different, I'm presenting theistic evolution as one view. It's not one view. There are many other ways to look at it. I'm just trying to give you sort of a frame of reference. But there are many other ways to look at it, many other type of models. I would say this is maybe just more like the classic theistic evolutionist. But there are other models, right? So this is just intended to kind of get you started thinking about it. If you're interested in looking at this kind of stuff and studying it. But yeah, I appreciate that. I wasn't aware of that one. I was not. Okay. Other questions? No? Okay. It's okay. It's okay to disagree. It's a secondary issue. It's a secondary issue. Now, denying that Jesus was God, not a secondary issue. But age of the earth, secondary issue. It's okay to disagree. It's not a prime doctrine. It's not an essential doctrine. Study it for yourself. Think about it for yourself. Yes?
Is denying Adam and Eve's physical existence a secondary or primary issue?
I would say, good question. I would say given the biblical evidence that they were actual, literal, historical people, I would say that is a very long stretch. That is a very difficult position to defend biblically. And I would say that would fall into a primary position. Now some might disagree, but you got a long way to go to try to make the case that that whole description was just figurative. It's very difficult to defend that. But again, it's possible. Somebody could say it's a secondary matter. I would say it's probably primary for a number of reasons. But it's a good question. A good question.
process, and so they were real physical people, but God created them through the evolutionary process.
Well, then, if they were created through the evolutionary process, they would be real physical people. They
Right,
wouldn't be
so-
fictional.
Right, so would you say then that that would fall under aligning with scripture in that they were real physical people? is what you're
Yes,
saying,
but
is
it wouldn't
it's
align with the verses that say Adam and Eve were created in Genesis 1, 26, 27, 28. It wouldn't agree with this. Yes, they were actual physical people, but oh shoot, I turned it off. But it wouldn't agree with this. Yep. Right, it would not agree with this. Unless you interpret that as purely figurative, it would not agree with this. It would directly contradict this. So, again, possible, yes. Likely, no, probably not. Again, and that's because of this. There's really good evidence to say that they weren't figurative, mythological creatures. So, but yeah, they were. I think we would agree they could be created by evolutionary processes and be physical humans, but then they didn't get here by this. So that'd be your sticking point. You'd have to deal with that. Yeah.
Do you hold also to the view that the ages in the Old Testament were literal ages, like Methuselah living to 969 years?
So I would say, yes, a good question. So let's go back here. Where did it go? I gotta find it now. Hold on. And let me find it. Where did it go? Nope, wait, I think I went too far. Where did it go? Talk about Adam. Yeah. Adam living to 930 years. Yeah, I would say that could be understood to be literal. That could be understood to be literal. Now again, you have to keep in mind, this is Genesis 5, right? So, but yes, I would say you could interpret that as what we would understand today is 930 years. Now some might disagree, but I think you could. Yes?
Would you say that God being the creator is a primary issue?
In all of this?
I'm not saying necessarily with evolution.
Okay.
But it's one of those things we would have to agree on, that God is creator.
Yes, for a biblical theistic view.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that's something we wouldn't, as believers, be able to have different opinions.
I would agree. I would say that, I keep going the wrong way here. I would say that we probably would want to agree, why do I keep missing it? We would probably want to agree, this would be a primary issue right here, that, where did it go? Why do I keep missing it? Yes, you're right, I'm not sure where the slide went, but the one that talked about Adam and Eve being created, I think that would be a primary idea. That would be a primary idea in Scripture. I don't know where it went, I can't seem to find it.
It's all through scripture. Colossians 1:16, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth,
Yep.
visible and invisible.
Yep.
Whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him.
And I think
And
you
all
would.
through the Psalms, it talks about, and Job tells them he's created.
Yeah, I think you would have to affirm, if you deny God as creator, that would seem to be a very strongly unbiblical position, I think. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the different translations of Genesis 1:1, where instead of it saying, in the beginning God created, it says, when God began to create? What are your
Yes.
views on this, and does this play into our view of how old the earth and universe are?
I think it could, but I don't think you can infer the age from that.
But do you think it's possible that the age happened before Genesis 1:1, and then there is a literal 7-day creation?
It's possible. That is, I'm gonna find it now. That is I gotta find it. I'm gonna find it, I promise, I'm gonna find it. Where did it go? Okay, well, I'm going the wrong way again, that's why I'm not gonna find it. This is what happens when you have too many slides. Yeah, what you just described is the, hold on, I'm getting there. What you just described is that. That's the day gap model.
Not exactly. The model I was describing puts the gap before day 1.
Oh, before day 1. That's another one I haven't listed. That's another one I haven't listed. There are numerous other models. I just listed some of the more prevalent ones. But yes, there is one that would say there was a gap even before day 1. I don't know how easy that is to defend. It's possible, but wouldn't that be day 1? Like, wouldn't that gap be day 1?
No, because God would have created. Many biblical scholars translate Genesis 1 actually as when God began to create.
So there was time before that, is what you're saying.
So God, and then the New Testament, Old Testament both affirm that God created everything.
Okay.
But Genesis chapter 1 may not be speaking about the ex nihilo creation.
Okay.
So that it starts at this point in time, but not necessarily at the beginning of time.
So wouldn't that support more, or couldn't that support the old earth, young creation?
Sure. I mean, it could support any old earth view.
Yeah, okay, yeah, possible. Certainly possible, yeah, certainly possible. And again, these are just some of the more prevalent ones, but there have been many more. But yeah. Look, there's a lot of uncertainty here. Was there a gap in the beginning? Was there a gap between day 1 and day 2? What was the gap a day long? Was the gap undefined? Were the days 24 hours? Were the days not 24 hours? Yeah, a lot of uncertainty in terms of how to understand that. Yeah.
How do you explain the Neanderthals? Were they descendants of Adam and Eve?
Yeah, good question. So we've been talking about that one. So there are some would say that they would be descendants of Adam and Eve. That would be the view that some would hold. I don't know that I hold that view, but I haven't researched it enough to know for sure. But that is what some would say. But it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
What is your interpretation on like the first day of creation between the third day of creation when God made this dark, light and dark, and
Yep.
then when he made the sun, moon, and stars?
Yep.
What would you say the difference is? Because in my point of view, I mean, I'm trying to think of how it would work for 1,000-day increments of like what is supposed to be for old earth but new creation.
Okay.
Just kind of think about how trees would survive if that light that he said is actual, like if it isn't theoretical.
Right.
If he actually meant that, or because I mean, obviously the trees need the sun to survive. So how could that be 1,000 years instead of?
Yeah. We don't know. We don't know. It's a good question. It's a good, again, it's not, there are different ways of looking at it. It's not immediately clear, right? So yes, it's possible that that would be a problem with that view. Yeah, it would be. Yeah, somebody have it? Yeah.
Building off of what Jack said earlier, yeah, there is a view when it comes to interpreting, say, Genesis, that various ages we read are symbolic. So they didn't literally live these hundreds of years for certain Old Testament figures. I think John was bringing up Michael Jones and Inspiring Philosophy. He's brought forth this idea that scholars have touched upon, such as Kenneth Kitchen and on the reliability of the Old Testament. For instance, Joseph of Genesis is given the age of 110, but apparently that was the idealized age in Egyptian mythology. So if you hold that view or you affirm that view, that doesn't mean Joseph literally lived 110 years. So symbolic.
Again, you see symbolic language and you see literal language, right? So yes, that's all more to the point, I think. Yeah.
So you're talking about how like the dating for carbon, so like it only they can really only be around what, about 50,000 years.
Yeah.
So how do scientists come to a conclusion like if they're talking about like say horseshoe crabs, dinosaurs, like when they're talking about the moon alive like millions of years ago, how do they come to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I buried that in here somewhere. Let's see. That's the old Earth. Let me find it. There are other radiometric dating techniques besides carbon-14, in case you're interested. So there is sodium-14-15, there's sulfur, rubidium, strontium. I mean, potassium argon. There's many other types of radiometric dating techniques that can be used besides. Carbon-14 is like the most popular, everybody's heard of it, but that really is only one of many different types of techniques.
Are the other techniques, are they still reliable out to like millions of years?
Yeah, they are, because the half-lives are much longer than carbon-14.
Gotcha, okay.
So, the one thing I find interesting, and I mean, you can make of this what you want, is when we find meteorites that land, you know, every now and then we have meteorites land on the Earth, right? And they come from interstellar space, like our solar system, and we do the potassium argon dating, they come up with an age that is about what scientists would say is the age of the Earth. And they didn't come from Earth. They came from outside of Earth, like somewhere else in our solar system. Interesting. Maybe that points to the fact that maybe the Earth was created when the solar system was created. Perhaps, right? Again, there's lots of interesting data here to think about and look at. Same thing with the moon. You know, our friends on Apollo 13, when they brought the moon, or I'm sorry, Apollo 11, brought the moon rocks back. Yeah. Dated to about 4 billion years old. Again, using the same techniques. Now, some people might say the moon came out of the Earth. I don't know about that. It's hard to know for sure if that's the case. But we do see some consistency with radiometric dating with inorganic matter, right? So again, it's just information. You can make of it what you want. Anyway, okay. What other questions? What other comments, thoughts, concerns? Again, I'm not affirming any view. I'm just telling you what these views are. Your job is to study. Oh yeah, that's right. That reminds me. Here, take a picture of this. I'm glad I thought about this. So here, you want to read more? Okay, not only I got all those books I showed you, but these are all really good sources if you want to study it. Read what people have written. Think about it. Ask questions. Investigate. Very, very interesting topics to discuss. Again, secondary issues for Christians when it comes to the age of the Earth. But you have to distinguish between primary and secondary, right? Don't get hung